My parents gave the entire inheritance to my brother and treated me like I didn't exist. They handed him the house, the business, the accounts, everything my father built over 30 years. And me? They gave me a sewing machine that belonged to a grandmother I barely remember. I sat in that lawyer's office and I smiled. I actually smiled, because I already knew something they didn't. I knew where the bodies were buried, financially speaking, and in about 6 weeks, that smile was going to cost my brother everything he thought he'd just won. If you've ever been the invisible child in your own family, stay with me because this one is going to feel personal. And if it does, hit subscribe because karma in this story doesn't come from luck. It comes from paperwork. Is this some kind of joke? That's what I said, sitting in a leather chair in Attorney Grimes's office in downtown Columbus, Ohio, staring at a single typed page with my name on it. One line. To my daughter Sarah, I leave the Singer sewing machine belonging to her late grandmother. That was it. That was 34 years of being someone's daughter, reduced to one sentence and a sewing machine that didn't even work. My brother Ryan sat 2 seats away from me, arms crossed, doing that thing where he presses his lips together to keep from smiling. He didn't hide it well. He never had to. Mitchell's Hardware, the family home on Cedar Lane, all investment accounts and remaining assets are to be transferred in full to my son, Ryan Mitchell. My mother, Linda, wouldn't even look at me. She kept her eyes on her hands, folded neatly in her lap like she was praying for the meeting to be over. My father, Robert, had passed 4 months earlier. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, and no chance for me to ask him why. So the man who built that hardware store from a single rented garage in 1989 left it all to the son who never once worked a real shift on that floor, and gave the daughter who ran the books for 11 years a broken sewing machine. Say something, Ryan said, finally letting that smirk break loose. Congratulations, I said, and I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of that office like my chest wasn't caving in. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I want you to know that, because I know that's what you're expecting. I sat in my car, hands on the wheel, and I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I finally understood what game had been played on me for 11 straight years, and I was done being the person who didn't see it coming. Let me back up, because you need to understand who Ryan Mitchell actually is before I show you how far he fell. Ryan is 2 years older than me, and growing up he was the golden one. Quarterback in high school, business degree from Ohio State that my parents paid for in full, cash, no loans. Me? I went to community college at night while working the register at Mitchell's Hardware during the day because the store needs you more right now, Sarah. Ryan's busy with school. That's a direct quote from my mother, spoken in 2011, and it set the tone for the next 13 years of my life. When Ryan graduated, he didn't come work at the store either. He tried 3 different startups, all funded partially by my parents, all failed within 18 months. Meanwhile, I was doing the books, managing inventory, handling payroll for 6 employees, and eventually running daily operations while my father slowly stepped back due to his health. I want to be clear about something because this matters a lot for what happens later. I was never officially paid a salary that matched my role. I was paid an hourly wage, like a part-time clerk, while functionally running a 6-figure hardware business. When I brought this up to my father in 2019, he said, "Sarah, everything I have is going to you kids eventually. Don't worry about the paycheck now. Think of the bigger picture." I believed him. That's the part that still stings. I believed him because he was my father, and because for years that seemed to be true. Then in 2021, Ryan came back. Broke, divorced, and suddenly extremely interested in helping out at the store. And that's when things started shifting in a direction I didn't understand at the time. My father started taking Ryan into his office for long meetings. Documents got signed that I wasn't shown. And slowly, quietly, I started getting cut out of decisions I used to make every single day. Here's where it gets worse, and this is the part I didn't find out until after the funeral. About 4 months before my father died, Ryan convinced him to restructure the ownership of Mitchell's Hardware. On paper, it looked like a simple tax move, something about protecting the family business from liability. What it actually did was quietly remove my name from a profit-sharing agreement my father had verbally promised me back in 2015, an agreement I had never gotten in writing, because I trusted him. I found this out 3 weeks after the will reading, when I was going through old boxes in my apartment and found a folder I'd forgotten I had. Inside was a signed letter from 2015, handwritten by my father, outlining that upon his passing or retirement, ownership of Mitchell's Hardware would be split 60% to me and 40% to Ryan, based on, and I'm quoting his words, who actually built this place with me. It wasn't notarized, it wasn't a legal will, but it was his handwriting, his signature, and it was dated 6 years before he died. I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 at night holding that letter, and for the first time since the funeral, I actually cried. Not because the money mattered so much, because it proved I wasn't crazy. He had meant to take care of me. Someone had changed his mind, and I had a pretty good idea who. I need to tell you about a specific memory, because it's the one that kept replaying in my head that whole week. Back in 2018, my father had a minor heart scare, nothing major, just enough to land him in the hospital overnight for observation. I was the one who sat with him until 2 in the morning, because Ryan was in the middle of a deal and couldn't make it, a deal that later turned out to be a poker game with 2 of his college buddies. My father held my hand that night, and he said, "Sarah, you're the one who shows up. Don't ever think I don't see that." I believed those words for 6 years. I built my entire sense of worth in that family around them. And now, sitting in my apartment holding a letter that proved he meant every word, I had to face the fact that showing up hadn't been enough to protect what he'd promised me, because somewhere along the way, someone else had gotten to him first. So here's the twist that changed everything, the one that turned this from heartbreak into a mission. 2 weeks after finding that letter, I was doing something I probably shouldn't have been doing anymore, since I no longer technically worked there. I still had remote access to the old accounting software, because nobody had bothered to revoke it. Ryan clearly didn't think I'd ever check again. I logged in one night, mostly out of grief, just wanting to look at numbers that used to make sense to me. And I found something that made my stomach drop. Over the previous 14 months, nearly $91,000 had been transferred out of the business account in small, irregular payments, labeled vaguely as vendor services and consulting fees. I recognized the routing pattern immediately because I was the one who built that accounting system. Every single transfer led back to a personal account under Ryan's name. He wasn't just Golden Boy who got handed everything. He had been quietly draining the business for over a year while our father was sick, while I was working unpaid overtime trying to keep the place afloat, while my mother was too exhausted with hospital visits to check a single bank statement. And now, he owned the whole thing outright. That's the double betrayal. It wasn't just that they gave him everything and gave me nothing. It's that the everything he got was partially stolen from the business while our father was dying, and I was the one who'd spent over a decade protecting that same business like it was my own child. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there staring at spreadsheets until 4 in the morning, and by the time the sun came up, I wasn't sad anymore. I was something colder and, honestly, something clearer than I'd felt in years. I went back through the records again the next evening, this time with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold before I even took a sip. I wanted to be absolutely certain before I let myself believe what the numbers were telling me. I cross-referenced every single transfer against the vendor list I had personally built years earlier, back when Ryan didn't even know how to log into the point-of-sale system. None of the transfers matched a real vendor. Not one. The names on those transactions, Apex Consulting Group, Midwest Vendor Solutions, didn't exist anywhere in our supplier database, our tax filings, or a single Google search. They were shell names, plain and simple, invented to make theft look like business expenses. and the timing made my chest tighten in a way I still remember. Half of those transfers happened during the exact weeks my father was in and out of chemotherapy, weeks when my mother was too consumed with hospital appointments to even glance at a bank statement, weeks when I had reduced my own hours at the store because I was the one driving him to treatments twice a week. Ryan wasn't just stealing. He was stealing during the one window of time he knew, with absolute certainty, that nobody was watching closely enough to catch him. That's the part that turned my grief into something sharper. I want to be honest with you about where I was emotionally at that point, because this story isn't just about numbers and legal moves. For about 3 weeks after finding those transfers, I fell into what I can only describe as a fog. I stopped answering calls from extended family who wanted to check in. I stopped going to the gym. I ate cereal for dinner more nights than I want to admit. My mother called twice, and both times I let it go to voicemail, because I genuinely didn't know if I could speak to her without saying something I couldn't take back. The worst part wasn't the money. I need you to understand that. The worst part was replaying 11 years of 80-hour work weeks, holiday shifts I covered so Ryan could go on vacation, birthdays I missed because the store needs coverage, and realizing that in my parents' eyes, none of it had ever counted as building anything. Only Ryan's name was on the door now. Only Ryan's signature mattered. I remember standing in my kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at that old sewing machine sitting in the corner of my living room, still in the box it came in, and thinking, this is what 11 years of loyalty gets you. A broken machine and a locked door. There was one night, maybe the lowest of that whole stretch, when I actually drove past Mitchell's Hardware at almost midnight, just to sit in my car across the street and look at it. The lights were off. The same neon open sign I used to flip on myself every single morning for 11 years now belonged to someone who couldn't tell you the difference between a socket wrench and a torque wrench. I remember thinking, this building knows my hands better than it knows his. I know which floorboard creaks near the paint counter. I know which employees need a 5-minute pep talk on Monday mornings and which ones just need coffee and silence. I know the exact sound the old delivery truck makes when it needs an oil change. None of that mattered on paper. None of that showed up in a will. I sat there in my car crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral itself. Not pretty tears. The kind that come from somewhere much older than a lawyer's office. The kind that come from a lifetime of quietly hoping that eventually, somehow, the effort would be seen. I called in sick to my analyst job twice that week, which I never do, and my supervisor, bless her, didn't ask questions. She just said, take the time you need. I didn't tell her why. I didn't tell anyone why, honestly, because saying it out loud, my family gave everything to my brother and I found out he stole from our dying father, made it feel unbearably real in a way that just thinking it hadn't. But grief has this strange way of curdling into clarity if you let it sit long enough. And one night, instead of crying, I opened my laptop and I started making a list. Not a list of grievances, a list of facts. Because facts, unlike feelings, hold up in court. The first thing I did was call my old college roommate, Denise, who happens to be a business litigation attorney in Cleveland. I didn't call her as a friend that night. I called her as a client. I laid out everything, the handwritten 2015 letter, the restructured ownership documents, the suspicious transfers, all of it, and I asked her one simple question. Do I have anything real here? Or am I just angry? Denise was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. Sarah, angry people don't usually have receipts. You have receipts. That handwritten letter, even though it wasn't a legal will, could potentially be used to demonstrate my father's clear and consistent intent regarding the business, especially combined with evidence that I had contributed labor and value to the company for over a decade without proper compensation, which in Ohio can sometimes support what's called an unjust enrichment or promissory estoppel claim. In plain English, that means the law recognizes it's not fair for someone to benefit from a promise while the person who relied on that promise gets nothing. But Denise said the real weapon wasn't the letter. It was the financial transfers. "If what you're describing is accurate," she said, "your brother didn't just get a bigger inheritance. He may have committed fraud against a business he didn't fully own yet, while your father was alive and incapacitated by illness. That's not a family dispute anymore, Sarah. That's potentially criminal." I remember sitting back in my chair and feeling something shift in my chest. For the first time since the will reading, I wasn't just hurt. I had a plan. Over the next several weeks, I moved quietly, methodically, and I told absolutely no one in my family what I was doing. Step 1 was documentation. I made copies, backups, and secure cloud storage of every single financial record I could legally access, including the years of statements I had personally compiled while working there. Statements Ryan clearly forgot I still had access to on my personal drive from years of remote bookkeeping. Step 2 was verifying the handwritten letter. Denise helped me get it authenticated by a document examiner who confirmed the handwriting and ink aging were consistent with the 2015 date. Step 3, and this is the part that made my hands shake while I did it, was requesting a formal forensic accounting audit of Mitchell's hardware. Because here's something most people don't know. Even though Ryan now legally owned the business, Ohio law still allowed a formal audit request tied to the estate, since some of those suspicious transfers happened before my father's death, meaning they occurred while the business was still legally part of his estate, not yet fully transferred to Ryan. That single detail changed everything. It meant the missing $91,000 wasn't just a family embarrassment. It was potentially estate theft. And estate theft is something a probate court takes very, very seriously. Denise walked me through exactly what a forensic audit request would involve, step by step, and I remember writing it all down like I was studying for the most important exam of my life. Because in a way, I was. First, we needed to establish standing, meaning I had to prove I had a legitimate interest in the estate, which wasn't hard given that I was named as a beneficiary, even if that beneficiary status only amounted to a sewing machine. Second, we needed a formal petition filed with Franklin County Probate Court, requesting an independent forensic accountant be appointed to review all estate-related financial activity within the 12 months preceding my father's death. Third, and this part made my stomach twist with nerves, we needed to notify Ryan's attorney that the petition had been filed, which meant there was no more quiet phase after this point. No more collecting evidence in secret. Once that petition went in, the countdown started, and there was no walking it back. I remember sitting in Denise's office the night before we filed, staring at the stack of printed bank statements, the authenticated letter sealed in a plastic sleeve, Mr. Alvarez's signed statement, and I asked her one last time, "What if I'm wrong about this? What if there's some explanation I'm not seeing?" Denise looked at me for a long moment and said, "Sarah, if there's an innocent explanation, the audit will prove that too, and you'll know for certain instead of wondering for the rest of your life. Either way, you deserve the truth." That settled something in me. I wasn't doing this to destroy my brother. I was doing this because I refused to spend the next 30 years wondering. While Denise handled the legal groundwork, I reached out to someone else. Someone Ryan never saw coming. Mr. Alvarez, the accountant who had worked with my father for almost 20 years before quietly being let go by Ryan 6 months after our father's diagnosis. I always wondered why Dad's longtime accountant suddenly vanished. Turns out, Mr. Alvarez had flagged some of Ryan's early spending patterns and gotten pushback for asking too many questions. When I called him, he didn't even hesitate. "I always felt like something wasn't right there," he told me. "I just didn't have proof. If you do, I'll help however I can." By the time I filed the formal audit request through the probate court, I had exactly what I needed: financial statements, the authenticated letter, Mr. Alvarez's professional testimony about irregularities he'd flagged before being dismissed, and a clean digital trail showing every single transfer from the business account straight into Ryan's personal one. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Ryan. I let the paperwork speak first. Exactly the way my father used to say every good deal should be made. Quietly, with proof, not emotion. The audit notice landed on Ryan's desk on a Tuesday morning, according to Mr. Alvarez, who still had a friend working the front counter at the store. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone was ringing. I let it go to voicemail 3 times before I finally picked up on the 4th. "What did you do?" Ryan's voice cracked through the phone, somewhere between fury and panic. "I requested a legally available audit of an estate asset," I said calmly. "Is there a problem with that?" "You're trying to destroy me over a sewing machine, is that it? Grow up, Sarah." "No," I said. "I'm trying to understand where $91,000 of Dad's business went while he was dying, and you're the only signature on those transfers." Silence. Real silence. The kind that tells you everything. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he finally said, but his voice had lost that smug, golden boy confidence I'd heard my whole life. "I have every idea," I said, "because I built that accounting system, remember? You should have changed my login before you started moving money out of it." I hung up before he could respond, and for the first time in months, my hands weren't shaking. His were. The forensic audit took 6 weeks. 6 long, tense weeks where my mother left me increasingly desperate voicemails asking why I was tearing this family apart. And Ryan alternated between threatening legal action against me and going quiet for days at a time, which Denise told me was actually a good sign. "Guilty people go quiet when they're trying to figure out how much you actually have," she said. During those 6 weeks, I kept working my regular job as a financial analyst downtown, kept paying my rent, kept living my life, because I had promised myself something important. Win or lose, I wasn't going to let this consume every part of who I was. I owed myself that much after everything I'd already given up. Then, on a Thursday in late October, Denise called me at 11 in the morning while I was in a meeting. I stepped out into the hallway and she didn't even say hello. "The audit's done, Sarah. Sit down." The forensic accountants confirmed everything. $91,412 in unauthorized transfers made while the business was still legally part of our father's estate, funneled directly into Ryan's personal accounts under falsified vendor descriptions. On top of that, they found something even Denise hadn't expected. Ryan had forged our father's electronic signature on 2 separate vendor authorization forms, 3 weeks before Dad passed away, while he was heavily medicated and, according to hospital records Denise had subpoenaed, not lucid enough to legally authorize any financial transaction. That wasn't just fraud against the estate anymore. That was potential elder financial exploitation, a charge Ohio prosecutors take extremely seriously, especially when hospital documentation proves the victim's diminished capacity at the time. I remember standing in that office hallway, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something between vindication and heartbreak, because part of me had hoped I was wrong. Part of me had hoped there was some innocent explanation, that my brother wasn't actually capable of forging our dying father's signature to steal from the business I'd spent 11 years protecting. He was. And now there was proof. The probate court moved quickly once the forensic report was filed. Given the evidence of fraud committed against the estate before the ownership transfer was finalized, the court froze the transfer of Mitchell's hardware pending a full investigation, which meant Ryan's inheritance was suddenly, legally, on hold. Denise also filed a civil claim on my behalf, using the authenticated 2015 letter alongside documentation of my 11 years of underpaid labor, arguing for a rightful ownership stake based on my father's clearly documented intent and my substantial uncompensated contribution to building the business's value. But the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment that mattered most to me, wasn't a courtroom. It was the Mitchell's Hardware 35th anniversary event, an event Ryan had already scheduled months earlier, planning to announce himself publicly as the new sole owner in front of employees, longtime customers, local business partners, and even a reporter from the local paper who covered small business milestones. He had no idea the court order freezing the transfer would land 3 days before that event. He also had no idea I was going to be there. I walked into Mitchell's Hardware on a crisp Saturday morning in November, wearing a plain gray blazer, holding nothing but a folder and my phone, and I watched my brother's face go white as chalk the second he saw me in the crowd. The store was decorated with balloons and a banner that read 35 years strong, new chapter ahead, and there were probably 60 people gathered, employees I'd hired myself years earlier, longtime customers who used to ask me for advice on power tools, and my mother, standing near the front, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Ryan stepped up to a small podium near the register, microphone in hand, clearly ready to deliver a speech about legacy and leadership. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice shakier than he probably wanted anyone to notice. "Today marks 35 years since my father built this store from nothing, and I'm honored to step into his shoes as the sole owner of Mitchell's Hardware." That's when I raised my hand, and the reporter, sensing something, turned her recorder toward me. "Actually," I said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "that's not accurate, and I think everyone here deserves to know why." The room went dead silent. 3 days ago, Franklin County Probate Court froze the transfer of this business, pending an active fraud investigation into misuse of estate funds. Nearly $91,000 was taken from this business while our father was terminally ill, using forged authorizations. Someone in the crowd gasped audibly. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Ryan's face had gone from white to a blotchy red, and he lunged for the microphone stand like he could somehow physically stop what was already happening. "That's not... She's lying. This is a family disagreement. This has nothing to do with..." "It has everything to do with this store," I said, stepping forward. "Because I have the forensic audit right here, and it's already filed with the court, along with hospital records showing Dad wasn't even lucid when those authorization forms were supposedly signed." I wasn't yelling. "I want you to understand that, because I had promised myself I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching me lose control." I spoke calmly, clearly, the same way I used to explain quarterly numbers to my father at the kitchen table every Sunday night for over a decade. "I'm not here to destroy this store," I continued, looking around the room at faces I actually recognized, employees whose paychecks I used to process personally. "I'm here because I spent 11 years of my life making sure this place survived, usually for less pay than the teenagers stocking shelves, and I refuse to stand here silently while it gets stolen twice, once from me and once from my dying father." The reporter was scribbling notes furiously. A few employees actually started clapping, quietly at first, then louder, and I watched something in my mother's face crack open, years of denial finally meeting a truth she could no longer avoid. "Ryan," she said, voice trembling, turning toward him instead of me for the first time in months. "Is this true?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, microphone still in his hand, mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find a lie big enough to cover the truth that was now sitting in a court filing with his forged signature attached to it. That silence was louder than anything I could have said. An older man near the back of the crowd, Mr. Petrosky, who had been buying his lumber and nails from us since before I was even born, walked up to me afterward and squeezed my shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you, and honestly, a little relieved," he said quietly. "He always worried Ryan wasn't ready for this. I think some part of him knew." One of our longtime employees, Danny, who I'd hired straight out of high school 8 years earlier and who now managed the paint department, came up to me with tears in his eyes. "I almost quit last month," he admitted. "Ryan cut our holiday bonuses to cover some cash flow issue. I guess now we know what the issue actually was." That hit me harder than almost anything else that day, because it meant Ryan's greed hadn't just hurt our family. It had trickled down onto people who depended on that paycheck to feed their own kids, people who had nothing to do with our family drama and everything to lose because of it. My mother didn't leave right away. She stood near the podium for a long time after most of the crowd had dispersed, just staring at the banner that read "New Chapter Ahead," like she was seeing the whole situation clearly for the first time. Within 2 weeks, The story had spread through our small business community, partly because of the reporter's article titled "Family Business Milestone Turns into Fraud Investigation," which, I'll be honest, wasn't the headline Ryan had been hoping for. Vendors who'd worked with the store for years started asking questions. Two of them quietly pulled their contracts, unwilling to be associated with a business under active fraud investigation. Ryan hired his own attorney, obviously, but forged signatures on financial documents combined with hospital records. Proving diminished capacity is not the kind of case most lawyers want to fight for very long, especially once they see forensic accounting reports as detailed as the ones Denise had compiled. 6 weeks later, Ryan agreed to a settlement rather than face formal criminal charges for estate fraud and forgery, a settlement Denise negotiated on my behalf. He returned the full $91,000 to the estate, with interest. The probate court, honoring both the authenticated 2015 letter and the documented value of my 11 years of underpaid labor, awarded me 60% ownership of Mitchell's Hardware, exactly what my father had promised in writing years earlier, with Ryan retaining a minority 40% stake, contingent on him stepping back from daily operations for a probationary period determined by the court. He didn't go to prison. I want to be honest about that, because some of you are probably hoping for handcuffs, and that's not what happened here, and honestly, that was never really the point for me. The point was truth. The point was making sure the people who mattered, the employees, the community, our mother, finally saw what actually happened, instead of the polished version Ryan had been selling for months. As for my mother, something shifted after that day at the podium. She called me 2 days later, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, she didn't ask why I was tearing the family apart. She asked if I was okay. "We're rebuilding something now, slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything that's been cracked for a long time. It's not perfect. Ryan and I don't speak much, and honestly, I'm okay with that for now. Trust isn't something you get back just because a court ordered a settlement. That has to be earned all over again, on his side, not mine. I run Mitchell's Hardware now, the way my father always trusted me to, and last month, we celebrated our 35th anniversary again. Quietly this time, no big banners, no forged confidence. Just employees who finally know their paychecks are safe, and a business that's finally being run by the person who actually built it. One long, unpaid, overlooked shift at a time. I reinstated Danny's holiday bonus the very first week, backdated to cover what he'd lost. I brought Mr. Alvarez back on as our accountant, because loyalty like his is worth more than any fresh hire straight out of business school. I even framed a copy of that 2015 letter, the handwritten one, and hung it in the small office at the back of the store. Not as a trophy, but as a promise to myself that I'll never again let someone else's silence decide what I'm worth. Some nights, closing up alone, flipping that same neon sign to "closed" the way I used to every single evening for over a decade, I catch myself thinking about my father. And I like to believe that somewhere, he's not disappointed in how any of this played out. I think he'd be relieved the truth finally found its way to the surface, even if it took a forensic audit and a very public microphone moment to get there. That sewing machine still sits in my living room, actually. I finally got it fixed. I keep it there on purpose, not as a reminder of what I lost, but as a reminder of what I refused to let define me. Because here's what I've learned through all of this, and I hope you carry it with you long after this video ends. People will show you exactly how much they value you, sometimes through a single line in a will, sometimes through years of quiet dismissal, and the real revenge was never about hurting anyone. It was about refusing to disappear. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever been the overlooked one in your own family, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Because next week, I'm telling you about the sister-in-law who thought she could forge her way into a family fortune until one DNA test changed everything.